The judge's gavel hovered in midair. Declan Prescott adjusted his custom-made Tom Ford tie and flashed a triumphant smirk at his much younger girlfriend sitting in the gallery. High had won. The houses would remain his, the company would remain his, even the offshore accounts were safely beyond his wife's reach. Then Marin leaned toward the microphone. 3 words changed everything. The Cook County family court smelled of lemon polish, stale coffee, and shattered promises. It had become the battleground for the destruction of Declan and Marin Prescott's marriage. But calling it a battleground was generous. A battle implied that both sides had a chance. This was a slaughter. Declan Prescott, the successful chief executive of a wildly profitable logistics software company, sat comfortably at the respondents' table. He carried the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he held every card in the deck. His dark suit was immaculate. His posture was loose and composed. Beside him sat Conrad Pike, an outrageously expensive divorce attorney known throughout Chicago's legal community as the Butcher. Pike charged $1,000 an hour to financially destroy spouses, and his wealthy clients considered him worth every penny. Across the aisle sat Marin. She looked exhausted. She wore a plain navy dress with no visible label, and her dark blonde hair had been pulled tightly into a severe clasp. Her hands rested in her lap, her fingers wrapped so firmly around a crumpled tissue that her knuckles had turned white. Beside her sat Eliza Ward, a capable family attorney who appeared hopelessly outmatched. Throughout the trial, Pike had systematically crushed nearly every argument she made with his aggressive legal tactics. At the center of the dispute was a prenuptial agreement signed before Declan and Marin were married. Back then, Declan had been a struggling software developer working from their cramped one-bedroom apartment. Marin had worked double shifts as a registered nurse to cover the rent and keep the electricity from being disconnected. The prenuptial agreement was supposed to be nothing more than a formality demanded by Declan's nervous early investors. It stated that if the marriage ended, Marin would receive a lump sum of $250,000, one vehicle, and absolutely no ownership in Declan's company, Apex Solutions. Apex Solutions was now valued at more than $80 million. Throughout the proceedings, Conrad Pike had constructed a ruthless narrative portraying Marin as an unmotivated, stagnant partner who had contributed nothing to Declan's success. He brought in financial experts who testified that Declan's singular brilliance had been the sole force behind the company's wealth. He described Marin as a woman who spent her days attending yoga classes and charity luncheons, while Declan exhausted himself building a business empire. It was a masterful and vicious rewriting of history. Pike conveniently ignored the countless hours Marin had spent acting as Declan's unpaid secretary. He never mentioned the nights she stayed awake reading contracts because they could not afford an attorney. He omitted the thousands of dollars from her nursing salary that she had invested in the company's first server racks. Sitting in the gallery behind Declan was Sloan Bennett. She was a former marketing assistant at Apex Solutions and Declan's current fiancé. Sloan sat with her legs crossed, idly scrolling through her phone. Occasionally, she exchanged a sympathetic yet mocking glance with Declan whenever Marin's attorney stumbled during cross-examination. Sloan had already selected the interior design for the Aspen Chalet. Declan had successfully argued that the property belonged to the corporation, making it completely untouchable in the divorce. Judge Everett Langford, a stern and experienced man, released a heavy sigh as he adjusted his reading glasses. He looked down at the towering stack of documents detailing the Prescott estate. "Mr. Pike?" Judge Langford said, his gravelly voice echoing through the high-ceilinged courtroom. "You have concluded your closing argument concerning the division of assets." He looked directly at Declan's attorney. "You maintain that the prenuptial agreement remains legally binding and that the petitioner has failed to establish any commingling of personal and corporate funds that would invalidate it." "That is correct, Your Honor." Pike rose and buttoned his suit jacket. "The law must remain blind to emotional complaints, regardless of how heavily opposing counsel chooses to rely upon them." He turned slightly toward Marin's table. "Mrs. Prescott signed a legally enforceable contract. Mr. Prescott has already been more than generous. He has offered to double the amount required under the agreement and provide her with $500,000 out of the goodness of his heart." Pike spread his hands. "We ask that the court honor the agreement and finalize the divorce so my client may move forward with his life." Declan kept his expression carefully neutral, but triumph glittered in his eyes. $500,000 was meaningless to him. It was little more than a rounding error on one of his quarterly tax filings. High had carefully hidden his true fortune, transferring tens of millions of dollars into offshore trusts and shell companies in preparation for this exact moment. High had planned his departure from the marriage with the same ruthless precision he used during a corporate takeover. Judge Langford turned toward Marin's table. "Ms. Ward, does the petitioner have anything further to present before I issue my final judgment?" Eliza Ward looked at her client. Marin's expression revealed nothing. Throughout the divorce, she had presented herself as a broken woman. She had cried during mediation. She had suffered panic attacks during depositions. She had begged Declan to treat her fairly out of respect for everything they had shared. Declan had consumed her fear like oxygen. It nourished his ego. But now, as the case approached its conclusion, Marin was not crying. She gave her lawyer a single nod. "Yes, Your Honor," Eliza said as she stood. She no longer sounded defeated. The nervous tremor that had once weakened her voice had completely disappeared. "We have one final submission for the court's consideration." Her voice was calm and clear. "It is evidence that directly affects the validity of the prenuptial agreement and the alleged separation of corporate property." Conrad Pike immediately rose. "Objection, Your Honor. Discovery has closed. Opposing counsel cannot ambush this court with evidence at the final moment." "Your Honor," Eliza replied smoothly, "this evidence only recently became available. It directly concerns fraud contained within the financial disclosures Mr. Prescott submitted to this court." She looked toward the judge. "Evidence of fraud against the court may be introduced whenever it is discovered." Judge Langford's eyebrows rose sharply. Fraud against the court was an enormous allegation. "Approach the bench," he ordered. The tension inside of the courtroom thickened instantly. Declan leaned forward, his confident smile weakening for the first time. "What the hell is she talking about?" he whispered harshly to his attorney. "Do not panic," Pike muttered from the corner of his mouth, never taking his eyes from the judge. "It is a desperate attempt to frighten us. They have nothing." At the bench, Eliza Ward handed the judge a thick manila envelope. "Your Honor, we received a verified and certified ledger from the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority, along with corresponding internal communications from Apex Solutions." She lowered her voice slightly. "The documents concern a holding company called Blackwood Logistics." At the respondent's table, a drop of cold sweat slid down Declan Prescott's back. Blackwood Logistics. How did she know that name? Blackwood was his ghost ship. It was a shell corporation created by a questionable wealth manager to hide the most valuable parts of his business empire. Declan had been draining Apex Solutions, transferring high-value intellectual property patents and millions of dollars in consulting fees directly into Blackwood. On paper, Apex appeared to have stopped growing, allowing Declan to justify the $80 million valuation he had presented to the court. But the true heart of his empire was held by Blackwood. The company owned next-generation artificial intelligence algorithms that were about to be purchased by a major defense contractor for nearly $400 million. No one knew about Blackwood except Declan and his offshore broker. Absolutely no one. "These documents," Eliza continued, speaking loudly enough for the courtroom microphone to carry every word, "demonstrate that Mr. Prescott deliberately committed perjury in his sworn financial affidavits." She faced the judge. "He concealed assets valued at approximately $350 million. Furious whispers erupted throughout the gallery. Sloane Bennett stopped looking at her phone. Her jaw fell open as she stared at the back of Declan's head. $350 million? "Order!" Judge Langford shouted, striking his gavel. He tore open the envelope and began examining the documents. Slowly, the color disappeared from his face. "Mr. Pike," he said, his voice becoming dangerously quiet, "are you aware of an entity called Blackwood Logistics?" Pike was an experienced professional. I did not sweat, but his eyes moved nervously. "Your Honor, I have no knowledge of that entity, nor can we verify the authenticity of documents introduced so late in the proceedings." "They carry the official seal of the Cayman Registry," Judge Langford snapped, raising one of the pages. "They also include wire transfer records that correspond directly with funds removed from Apex Solutions." He glared at Declan's attorney. "Funds your client testified were lost through server depreciation and failed research and development projects." "Your Honor, we require an opportunity to review this material," Pike said quickly. His aggressive confidence had vanished. "This is a serious procedural violation." "What is serious?" the judge interrupted, his voice booming across the courtroom. "Is a man sitting under oath and lying directly to my face." He raised the documents. "If these records are authentic, your client did not merely invalidate his prenuptial agreement through fraudulent non-disclosure." The judge's eyes narrowed. He committed a federal crime. Declan's hands began to tremble. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table in an attempt to steady himself. Then he looked across the aisle at Marin. She was staring directly at him. The exhausted, frightened woman from earlier in the proceedings had disappeared. Her back was straight. Her eyes, normally warm and gentle, were fixed upon him with the cold precision of a sniper. A barely visible smile touched one corner of her mouth. "She played me." The realization struck Declan with suffocating force. She had played him from the beginning. The crying, the panic attacks, and the desperate pleading had all been part of the performance. She had allowed him to build his arrogant and seemingly impenetrable defense. She had allowed Pike to parade witnesses before the court and drag her reputation through the dirt. She had allowed Declan to believe that victory was guaranteed. All the while, she'd have been holding a weapon beneath the table, waiting until he had committed every lie to the permanent legal record. "Ms. Ward," Judge Langford said, leaning over the bench, "these documents show that Blackwood Logistics has an extremely complicated ownership structure." I examined another page. "The primary shareholder appears to be a blind trust." "That is correct, Your Honor," Eliza replied. "Can you identify the beneficiary of that trust?" Declan held his breath. I believed he was the beneficiary. I had signed the documents through a proxy. Once the court proved that he owned the trust, he would lose a significant portion of it to Marin and probably face prison for perjury and tax evasion. It was a catastrophe. His life was over. But Eliza shook her head. No, Your Honor, Mr. Prescott is not the beneficiary. Declan blinked. The entire courtroom fell silent. Even Judge Langford appeared confused. I beg your pardon, counsel. If Mr. Prescott did not create the offshore structure to conceal assets for himself, then who is the beneficiary? Eliza turned slowly and looked at Declan with an expression of pure pity. Mr. Prescott believed he was creating it for himself, Your Honor, she explained. He hired a third-party wealth management company to establish the Blackwood Shell Corporation. She continued steadily. He communicated through encrypted email and used a proxy agent to sign the final document so that his own name would never appear in the formation records. Eliza paused. The silence surrounding Declan's table became unbearable. What Mr. Prescott did not know, she continued softly, was that the online proxy agent he hired was actually a private investigator working for my client. Her eyes remained fixed on Declan. Mrs. Prescott had already discovered his intention to hide the assets. Declan's blood turned to ice. His lungs seemed to stop working. He attempted to speak, but only a dry rasp escaped his throat. When the final documents for the blind trust were prepared, Eliza said, turning fully toward him. The investigator followed Mr. Prescott's instructions exactly. She paused. Except for one detail. He did not list Declan Prescott as the beneficiary. Then whose name appears on the beneficiary designation? Judge Langford asked, leaning forward in fascination. For the first time, Marin spoke. She leaned toward the microphone. Her voice was steady, controlled, and devastatingly calm. Mine, Your Honor. The silence in the courtroom became absolute. It was the kind of silence that followed a catastrophic collision, immediately before the screaming began. Declan stared at the woman who would soon become his ex-wife. His vision blurred at the edges. The Tom Ford tie that had felt like a symbol of victory now tightened around his neck like a hangman's noose. With a trembling hand, he loosened it. His breathing became shallow and irregular. Yours? Conrad Pike finally managed to say. The terrifying butcher of Chicago's family courts had lost all his authority. His voice emerged as a thin, frightened squeak. That is impossible. That is theft. That is wire fraud. Choose your words carefully, Mr. Pike, Judge Langford warned. His eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. You are standing on extremely thin ice. He turned toward Marin's attorney. Ms. Ward, you have the floor. Explain precisely what I am looking at. Eliza stepped away from the podium and moved toward the center of the courtroom. My client began noticing irregularities in the household finances, she explained. Mr. Prescott had always kept the finances of Apex Solutions secret. But Mrs. Prescott noticed severe and unexplained reductions in their lifestyle despite public announcements that the company was experiencing enormous growth. Marin remained perfectly still. Her hands no longer clutched the tissue. They rested calmly upon the mahogany table. Mrs. Prescott discovered an old tablet in the basement, Eliza continued. The device was still connected to Mr. Prescott's secondary cloud account. On that device, she found drafts of encrypted emails sent to Sovereign Wealth Partners, an offshore advisory company based in Geneva, Switzerland. Eliza lifted one of the printed messages. She read his detailed plan to intentionally reduce the apparent value of Apex Solutions and transfer its intellectual property into a hidden corporation, protecting those assets from the divorce he was already planning. In the gallery, Sloane released a loud, involuntary gasp. Declan flinched but did not dare look behind him. Rather than confronting her husband, Eliza continued, Mrs. Prescott hired Nolan Gallagher, a former investigator with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division who now operates a private intelligence company in Chicago. She gestured toward the documents. Mr. Gallagher specializes in tracking offshore tax evasion. This was an ambush, Pike shouted, slamming his hand against the table. High was desperately attempting to regain control of a case that had completely escaped him. Your Honor, this was an illegal entrapment operation. If she redirected his money, she committed grand larceny. They were marital assets, Mr. Pike, Judge Langford snapped. He pointed the gavel toward the respondent's table like a weapon. Your client was actively attempting to conceal them from this court. His voice hardened. Sit down and remain silent. I want to hear the rest. Pike slowly sat. He looked physically ill. Thank you, Your Honor, Eliza said. Mr. Gallagher created a digital trap. She continued. He knew Mr. Prescott needed an anonymous proxy service to act as the legal signatory for the Cayman Islands Trust. Mr. Prescott wanted his identity completely erased from the paper trail. Eliza held up another document. Mr. Gallagher's investigators posed as a discreet offshore proxy service called Horizon Fiduciary. They strategically advertised their services on the encrypted forums Mr. Prescott frequently visited. The blood drained completely from Declan's face. He remembered Horizon Fiduciary. High had carefully investigated them. High had paid them an enormous retainer in cryptocurrency. They had appeared professional, secretive, and merciless. They had been Marin. Mr. Prescott communicated his wishes in precise detail, Eliza explained as she raised the stack of decrypted emails. He instructed the proxy to establish Blackwood Logistics. He ordered the proxy to serve as its sole director. He also instructed the proxy to create a blind trust as the ultimate beneficiary. Eliza looked toward the judge. The only instruction the proxy did not follow was the name Mr. Prescott wanted placed on the beneficiary designation. Judge Langford leaned back in his leather chair. A look of deep astonishment and reluctant admiration spread across his stern face. So when Mr. Prescott transferred patents, algorithms, and liquid capital valued at $350 million into Blackwood Logistics, he paused. High was legally and irrevocably transferring those assets into a trust owned entirely by Marin Prescott. That is correct, Your Honor, Eliza replied with a definitive nod. An independent audit verified the chain of custody for every dollar. The complete report is included in our submission. Declan exploded from his chair. You, he screamed. The polished image of the arrogant chief executive shattered completely. You stole my company. You stole my life's work. I built that code. I created Apex. Bailiff! Judge Langford roared, striking his gavel with the force of a gunshot. One more outburst, Mr. Prescott, and you will spend the remainder of these proceedings in a holding cell for contempt. The judge pointed toward his chair. Sit down. Declan collapsed into his seat, breathing heavily. The walls of the courtroom seemed to close around him. He turned toward Conrad Pike, expecting his $1,000 an hour legal predator to produce some devastating counterargument. Instead, Pike was slowly moving his chair away from Declan. In the legal world, there was a strict boundary between aggressive representation and participation in a federal crime. Conrad Pike had built his career by dancing along that boundary. But as he stared at the forensic audit resting before the judge, he knew Declan Prescott had dragged him over the edge. Your Honor, Pike said as he stood. His voice trembled. I did not look at Declan. He looked directly at the judge. I would like the official record to reflect that neither I nor my firm had any knowledge of Blackwood Logistics, these offshore accounts, or the fraudulent financial statements submitted to this court. Declan whipped his head toward his attorney. Conrad, what are you doing? I am protecting my law license, Pike hissed through clenched teeth. He turned back to Judge Langford. Your Honor, given the sudden appearance of this evidence and the serious indications that my client committed fraud, I have been placed in an impossible ethical position. He straightened his jacket. I formally request permission to withdraw as counsel for the respondent effective immediately. A stunned murmur moved through the courtroom. An attorney abandoning his client as the case approached its conclusion was almost unheard of. It was the ultimate declaration of legal death. Your request is noted, Mr. Pike, but temporarily denied, Judge Langford said coldly. You will remain seated until I issue my ruling. High glared at Declan. I will not delay this case so Mr. Prescott can search for another attorney willing to repeat his lies. From the gallery came the sharp sound of high heels striking the hardwood floor. Everyone turned. Sloane Bennett had risen from her seat. Her face was pale. She looked at Declan, who was sweating heavily, abandoned by his own attorney and facing complete destruction. Then she looked toward Marin, who sat with the calm dignity of a queen who had just checkmated her opponent. Sloane said nothing. She lifted her designer handbag, turned, and walked out of the courtroom. The heavy wooden doors closed behind her with a decisive thud. The Aspen chalet was gone. The private jets were gone. The wealthy technology genius she believed she was marrying was about to become a penniless convicted criminal. Declan watched the doors close. His jaw trembled. I was completely and utterly alone. Judge Langford adjusted his glasses and looked down at the documents. Then he turned toward Marin. Mrs. Prescott, he said, his voice unexpectedly gentle, I have listened as opposing counsel portrayed you as a lazy and opportunistic spouse who contributed nothing to this marriage. I have watched you endure relentless attacks against your intelligence, your character, and your worth. Marin looked up at him. Tears shimmered in her eyes, but they were tears of relief rather than fear. It requires extraordinary strength to remain silent beneath that kind of cruelty, Judge Langford continued. His voice carried through the quiet courtroom. You knew exactly what evidence you possessed, yet you did not merely expose the fraud. You carefully and methodically dismantled it. The judge turned toward Declan. Every trace of gentleness disappeared. In its place came terrifying, righteous anger. Mr. Prescott, you sat in this courtroom under oath and swore that your financial disclosures were complete and truthful. You attempted to use the legal system as a weapon to financially starve the woman who supported you when you had nothing. His voice intensified. You created a prenuptial agreement designed to leave her with scraps. And when even that failed to satisfy your greed, you constructed an illegal scheme to conceal $350 million. Judge Langford picked up his pen. I am officially declaring the prenuptial agreement null and void. Habig in writing. It has been invalidated by the respondent's extreme, documented, and deliberate financial fraud. Declan buried his face in his hands. Furthermore, the judge continued, with regard to the division of assets, Mr. Prescott successfully arranged the transfer of Apex Solutions' most valuable property into the Blackwood Trust. High glanced toward Marin. I therefore affirm that the trust and the $350 million it controls are the sole and separate property of its lawful beneficiary, Marin Prescott. Eliza smiled and placed a reassuring hand on Marin's shoulder. As for the depleted remains of Apex Solutions, Judge Langford continued, I award 60% of all remaining shares, equity, and liquid capital to the petitioner as punitive compensation for the respondent's attempt to defraud the marital estate. He looked directly at Declan. You may retain the remaining 40%. The judge's expression became cold. You may also retain the debt you created while financing your offshore schemes. A hollow and broken sound escaped Declan's throat. High had entered the courtroom believing he controlled an empire worth nearly $400 million. High would leave with a minority share of a dying company and millions of dollars in legal and tax liabilities. Finally, Judge Langford said, gathering the forensic audit and the decrypted emails, I am ordering these exhibits unsealed. A copy of this transcript, along with all evidence related to Blackwood Logistics, will be forwarded to the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois and the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The judge fixed his gaze upon Declan. You chose to play a dangerous game with federal tax law, Mr. Bishop Prescott. I strongly recommend that you use your remaining share of the company to hire an exceptional criminal defense attorney. Judge Langford lifted the gavel. He looked at Marin once more and gave her a brief but respectful nod. This court is adjourned. The gavel struck the bench. The sound echoed through the courtroom like the final period at the end of a long and painful sentence. Marin stood. She smoothed the skirt of her simple navy dress. She did not gloat. She did not look at Declan as he sat frozen at the respondent's table, watching his entire life collapse into ashes. She simply picked up her purse, thanked Eliza Ward, and walked down the center aisle. Marin pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped into the crisp Chicago air. For the first time in far too long, she could breathe freely. She had played the long game, and she had won everything. What a powerful reminder that the truth always finds its way to the surface. Declan believed he could outsmart both his wife and the legal system. But Marin's brilliant plan proved that no betrayal remains hidden forever. If Marin's ultimate revenge left you speechless, press the like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life drama stories.